podcast was created as a supplemental learning resource for our cognitive psychology course. The content is based on course topics and readings from Essentials of Cognitive Psychology by Christopher Klein, along with instructor-developed explanations, examples, and pedagogical framing. AI tools were used to help transform course material into a conversational podcast format, including the use of AI-generated voices. The use of AI voice technology is intended to make the material more engaging, accessible, and flexible for students. However, the podcast should not replace careful reading of the textbook, reviewing course materials, or completing assigned activities. Any interpretations, examples, or explanations included in the podcast are provided for educational purposes and are the responsibility of the instructor. Students should rely on the assigned textbook, course lectures, and official course materials as the primary sources for exams, assignments, and class discussions.
Imagine a baby sitting in a room, right? And they're surrounded by dozens of adults who are all just speaking in these rapid overlapping streams of completely different languages.
Oh, it sounds like pure chaos, just a wall of noise.
Exactly. And there's no manual, there's no formal instruction, no like subtitles floating in the air for them to read.
Right.
Yet in just a few short years, without taking a single test, that baby's brain will have silently reverse engineered this incredibly complex mathematical code. A code of grammar and syntax that, honestly, the most advanced supercomputers on Earth still struggle to fully replicate.
It is arguably the most staggering computational feat the human brain performs.
Yeah, and today we are hacking into that human operating system. We are opening up Chapter 8 of your cognitive psychology studies, and we're diving deep into language.
I'm really glad we're doing this because when you look at cognitive psychology as a whole, it's really easy to treat language as just, another chapter, like somewhere after memory and right before problem solving.
Right, just another topic on the syllabus.
Exactly. But it really is the foundation of human intellect. We often fall into this habit of viewing language purely as a transmission device, a way to just say, the food is over there, or watch out for that car.
Like a walkie-talkie.
Yes, exactly like a walkie-talkie. But language isn't just how we broadcast our thoughts to others. It is the very architecture of how we think in the first place.
I mean, that is a massive distinction. We use it to access our own stored knowledge, to construct future scenarios, to, build complex social hierarchies.
Yeah.
If we didn't have language, our intelligence wouldn't just be trapped in our heads. It would be fundamentally handicapped. We'd be stuck in this permanent, immediate present.
The immediacy of the present is exactly what language shatters. And to understand how it does that, we really have to look at how language relies on basically every single cognitive process we've discussed in your previous chapters.
Right. It's all connected.
It is. You cannot process language without perception about, actually hearing the acoustic waves or seeing the manual signs.
Right.
You can't process it without selective attention, like filtering out the hum of the air conditioner to focus on a single voice.
Oh, absolutely.
And you certainly can't use it without an immense reliance on both working memory to hold a sentence together in real time and long-term memory to retrieve the actual meaning of the words. I mean, it is the ultimate synthesis of the human mind.
Which means we have a pretty daunting task ahead of us today.
A bit, yeah.
For this deep dive, we need to figure out what this invisible architecture is actually made of. We're going to look at the raw, microscopic materials of sound and meaning, and how the brain strings them together in real time without crashing.
And we'll get into how a tiny infant manages to acquire this system from scratch, plus the really fierce debates over whether this ability is wired into our DNA or learned from our environment.
Yeah, the debate gets heated. And finally, we have to ask the uncomfortable question, are we the only species on the planet that can actually do this?
It's a heavy lift, for sure. Yeah. But to truly understand cognition, we have to start at the absolute bottom, the microscopic level. Before we can talk about poetry or complex debate, we have to look at the raw physical data the brain is taking in.
Okay, so I used to think of letters as the smallest building blocks, but it really goes deeper than that, right? Down to what are called phonemes.
Yes, phonemes.
I've been trying to visualize this using kind of a digital analogy, like if a spoken sentence is a complex piece of software, a phone is basically the ones and zeros. It's the absolute smallest unit of sound that makes a meaningful difference in a language.
I think the binary code analogy works perfectly because by itself, a 1 or a 0 means nothing.
Right.
Just like by itself, the sound boo or the sound puh carries zero semantic weight. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, buzz just a noise.
Right. but they create a unit of contrast. Take the textbook example, the words bit and pit. They are identical except for that one initial phone.
The B and the P.
Exactly. But swapping that single acoustic wave completely rewrites the reality of what you're communicating.
But wait, I need to push back on the word acoustic for a second, because I actually completely missed this nuance the first time I went through the source material. We say sound, and we instantly think of vocal cords and breath and tongue placement.
Sure.
But phonemes aren't strictly acoustic, are they? Because, well, in sign languages, you don't have acoustic waves.
Oh, that is such a great point. You've hit on a really crucial neurological reality there. The brain doesn't actually care if the input is acoustic or visual. What it cares about is the contrast.
Right, the difference between the signals.
Exactly. So in American Sign Language, for example, a phone is defined by hand shape or hand placement or the specific movement of the gesture.
Okay.
So changing a flat hand to a fist while making the exact same motion is the direct cognitive equivalent of changing a B to a P. It is a cognitive unit of difference, completely regardless of the sensory channel it travels through.
That honestly blows my mind. The brain is just looking for the smallest unit of contrast. And here's where I get really fascinated by how our brains physically adapt to these contrasts. There's this example in the chapter about the K sound.
Oh, yeah.
To me, as a native English speaker, the K sound in the word cool and the K sound in the word keep, they are identical. I literally cannot hear a difference.
Right.
But to an Arabic speaker, those are two totally distinct phones. It's almost like I have this auditory blind spot.
You do. You absolutely do. And it's a blind spot that was artificially constructed by your own brain.
Wait, my brain did this on purpose.
It did. To understand the mechanism behind this, we have to look at how cognitive psychologists actually study infant perception. There's a really landmark 2002 study by Worker and Tees mentioned in the chapter.
Okay.
Obviously, they couldn't exactly ask babies what they were hearing, right? Because they're babies. So they used what's called a conditioned head-turn paradigm.
Okay, take us into the lab. How does a conditioned head-turn paradigm work?
So they sit a baby on a parent's lap, and they play a steady stream of sounds from a speaker, like ba-ba-ba.
Okay, just a repetitive sound.
Right. And whenever the sound changes, say from ba to da, a mechanical toy lights up right next to the speaker.
Oh, I see.
So the baby very quickly learns, oh, hey, when the sound changes, the fun toy lights up.
Oh.
So they start turning their head in anticipation the exact millisecond they hear a change.
Okay, so the head turn basically becomes the physical measurement for the researchers of whether the baby detected a new phone.
Precisely. And when Verker and Tees tested newborns and very young infants, they found something just astonishing. A 4-month-old infant is a universal listener.
Universal listener, meaning they hear everything.
Everything. They will turn their head for every single phonemic contrast in human existence. They can hear the difference between the Arabic K sounds, the Hindi retroflex consonants, the clicking consonants of Exosa. They hear it all perfectly.
That is wild, but I can't do that now. So, when do we lose that superpower?
Well, by the time that infant reaches 10 months of age, the ability is almost entirely gone.
10 months. That fast.
That fast. Their perception narrows aggressively to match only the phones spoken by the adults around them.
But why? I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, wouldn't it be an advantage to retain the ability to hear every sound? Why would the brain actively delete a capability like that?
It really comes down to brutal metabolic efficiency. The brain consumes an enormous amount of energy.
Right.
So by 10 months, your developing brain essentially realizes, look, I am only ever exposed to English. I am never going to need to distinguish between two obscure Hindi consonants.
So it's just a waste of battery life.
Exactly. Maintaining the neural pathways to process unused sounds is a waste of resources. So through a process of synaptic pruning, it literally severs those connections. It custom molds your auditory cortex to become an ultra-efficient processor for your specific native language.
Wow.
But of course, the cost is being blind to everything else.
It trades universal potential for specialized speed. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we have our phonemes are pruned, specialized ones and zeros. The next step up the ladder is the morpheme.
Right, morphemes.
If phonemes are the binary code, morphemes are like the first strings of executable code. They are the smallest units of actual meaning.
And it's vital to recognize that a morpheme isn't necessarily a whole word. I mean, a single word can be packed with multiple morphemes.
All right, let's break that down for the listeners. A word like dog is a single morpheme. You can't break it down any further without completely losing the meaning.
Right, the dead sound doesn't mean anything by itself.
Exactly. But if I add an S to make it dogs, that S is completely separate morpheme. It carries the semantic weight of plural.
Yes.
Or take modifiers, like the prefix re means to do again. You attach it to write, and you have rewrite, which is two morphemes.
And this modularity is exactly what gives language its infinite flexibility. You are taking these tiny packets of meaning and snapping them together like interlocking bricks.
Like Legos?
Like Legos. But, to build a house, just having a pile of bricks isn't enough. You need the structural blueprint, which in this case is syntax.
Yeah.
And you need to understand the neighborhood zoning laws, which is pragmatics.
The blueprint and the zoning laws. I really like that analogy. So syntax is the grammar. It's the strict kind of mathematical rule book for how words must be ordered.
Yes.
In English, we use subject-verb-object. The cat bit the dog. If I say, bid cat the dog thee, I have all the exact same morphemes, but I've shattered the syntax, so it just won't compile in your brain.
It just sounds like nonsense.
Yeah.
And pragmatics is that invisible social context layered on top of the syntax.
Right.
So if you ask me, do you have the time? The syntax and the literal semantics suggest you are asking a yes or no question about my possession of temporal information.
Like, do you currently own the concept of time?
Exactly. But the pragmatics of the situation tell me you actually want me to look at my watch and tell you what time it is right now. Pragmatics is how we read between the lines.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly complex system going on. We're perceiving pruned phones, we're snapping together morphemes, running it all through syntactic blueprints, and filtering it through social pragmatics.
It's a lot.
And we do this for dozens of words a minute. But here's what I don't get. When I read a sentence, I don't feel my brain working through all those steps. It just feels instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
How does the brain actually process a full sentence in real time without buffering?
Well, the short answer is it actually does buffer. And it makes a lot of rapid-fire assumptions that sometimes go disastrously wrong.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This brings us into the mechanics of sentence processing, and specifically a concept called parsing.
Parsing. I hear this term thrown around a lot in computer science, but how does it apply to human cognition here?
Parsing is basically the mental act of evaluating the meaning of a sentence as it unfolds in real time, word by word. You don't wait for the speaker to put a period at the end of their sentence before you start figuring out what they mean.
Right, that would be so slow.
Exactly. Your brain is aggressively building a structural tree of the syntax as the words are literally coming out of their mouth.
I have to admit, when I first looked at these parsing models in the chapter, I got incredibly tangled up between syntax and semantics. I know we just defined them, but I feel like I need a hard line drawn between the two to really understand how the brain fails at this.
It's a super common hurdle for students. Think of it this way. Syntax is the scaffolding. Semantics is the building material.
Okay.
You can build a perfectly structurally sound scaffolding that holds absolutely nothing of value. A sentence can follow every single rule of English grammar, perfect syntax, but still be utterly meaningless or just wildly ambiguous semantically.
Okay, to prove this point, I actually dug up some of the classic ambiguous newspaper headlines that are often used in cognitive psychology.
Oh, these are great.
These are completely real published headlines.
Yeah.
The syntax is flawless, but the way our brain parses them leads to absolute chaos. Here's one. Grandmother of 8 makes hole in 1.
Right, structurally it's perfect. But our parser hits the phrase hole in one and without context momentarily stumbles over whether this is a golf triumph or like a bizarre act of violence against someone named One.
All right, how about this one? Farmer Bill dies in house.
Okay, so is it an agricultural man named Bill passing away in a residence, or is it a piece of farming legislation being defeated in the House of Representatives?
Or my personal favorite, include your children when baking cookies.
Right, a syntactically valid instruction that semantically suggests cannibalism.
Exactly. But here's the cognitive mystery for me. Why are these funny? Like, why does my brain instinctively jump to the ridiculous cannibalistic meaning first before correcting itself a millisecond later?
It's a great question.
If my brain is so smart and complex, why doesn't it just read it the logical way the very first time?
This is where cognitive psychology gets truly fascinating. The reason you jump to the ridiculous meaning first is explained by a foundational theory called the Garden Path Model, which was proposed by Lynn Fraser in 1987.
Okay, the Garden Path Model.
The model posits that your brain's parser prioritizes speed over accuracy. It processes syntax, the structural grammar, before it processes semantics.
So my brain is literally building the scaffolding before it even checks to see what the building is supposed to be used for.
Exactly. You are led down a garden path by the grammar. The parser uses two incredibly rigid algorithmic rules to build this scaffolding as fast as possible.
Okay.
The first rule is called late closure.
Let's break late closure down. So the rule says that when a new word comes in, our brain naturally tries to attach it to the current phrase we are working on, rather than starting a new phrase.
Right. Consider this sentence. Since he always jogs a mile seems like a short distance.
Okay, wait. Since he always jogs a mile feels broken when I hear it.
It feels broken specifically because of late closure. As you read, since he always jogs, your brain opens a phrase, then the words a mile appear.
Right.
Because of late closure, your brain automatically attaches a mile to the jogging. You assume he jogs a mile, but then you hit the word seems.
Oh, and the syntax suddenly crashes.
Exactly. You realize a mile was actually supposed to be the subject of the next phrase. You have to consciously backtrack, rip the scaffolding down, and rebuild it as, since he always jogs, pause. A mile seems like a short distance.
Wow, it's literally a cognitive double take. We are tricked by our own brain's desire to just keep the current folder open as long as possible.
Yes.
And then the second rule the parser uses is minimal attachment. Now, I'll be honest, when I read about minimal attachment, I kind of wanted to play devil's advocate.
Oh, yeah, let's hear it.
The rule says the parser builds the absolute simplest syntactic structure possible, with the fewest number of branches on the grammatical tree. But if the human brain is capable of such massive nuanced complexity, why does it default to the absolute laziest structure?
It's a fair point.
Wouldn't evolution favor a parser that, anticipates complexity?
It's a great question, but you have to remember the bottleneck of working memory. Working memory can only hold so much information at one time.
Right, it's limited.
If your parser anticipated complex grammatical structures for every single sentence you heard, your working memory would overload instantly. Minimal attachment is an evolutionary survival mechanism for cognitive load. It assumes a simple structure because 95% of the time, sentences are simple.
It just takes the path of least resistance.
Yes. So when you read the headline, "Milk drinkers turn to powder," your brain's minimal attachment protocol sees the verb turn and the preposition to, and it links them in the simplest possible way, a physical transformation.
Right, people magically turning into dust.
Exactly. To interpret it as resorting to the use of powder requires a much more complex syntactic tree structure. Your brain refuses to build the complex tree until the simple tree fails the semantic logic test.
Okay, so parsing is essentially this rapid-fire, highly mathematical construction project happening in our heads, and it's governed by rigid rules of efficiency like late closure and minimal attachment.
That's a great summary.
It is incredibly sophisticated, which brings us to the most baffling paradox in the entire chapter, really.
Oh.
We are saying this is a highly complex algorithmic process.
Yeah.
Yet a 3-year-old toddler who cannot tie their shoes, who literally eats dirt, who has zero concept of formal logic, can parse a garden path sentence almost as well as I can.
It is pretty humbling.
How does an infant brain acquire an algorithmic system this complex?
That paradox right there is the battleground for one of the most vicious debates in the history of psychology. How do the origins of speech actually manifest in a human being?
Before we look at the theories of how it works, I think we have to look at the tragic evidence of what happens when the system is starved.
Yes, that's important.
Cognitive psychologists obviously can't lock a baby in a box to see what happens to their language development. But history has given us some horrifying natural case studies of early language deprivation.
It has. The two most cited cases in the literature are Victor, the wild child of Aveyron, who was discovered in the French woods in 1800 at roughly 12 years old. And then the much more modern, really tragic case of Jeannie, who was discovered in California in 1970 after being locked in an isolated room by her abusive father for the first 13 years of her life.
Both of these children survived severe isolation and were completely deprived of human language during their early childhood. And what happened when researchers finally tried to teach them to speak?
They failed. Despite years of really intense, dedicated tutoring by linguists and psychologists, neither Victor nor Jeannie were ever able to acquire full language.
Wow.
And it's vital to be precise about what they failed at. Jeannie was actually able to memorize quite a bit of vocabulary. She learned words, she learned the semantics.
But she couldn't build the scaffolding.
Exactly. She could never master syntax. She couldn't understand how to string the words together to form complex, generative thoughts. Her communication remained really fragmented.
That's so sad.
It is. These cases provided grim but undeniable evidence that early social interaction isn't just a cultural norm, it is a strict biological requirement. If the brain doesn't receive linguistic input during a specific early window, the neural hardware required to process syntax permanently atrophies.
So, assuming a healthy environment, what does the normal installation process of this operating system look like? The chapter lays out the developmental timeline, and honestly, it's remarkably fast.
It is fast. It begins with babbling, and it's important to understand that babbling isn't just a baby making random happy noises.
Right.
It is systematic motor practice. The infant is actively testing their vocal tract, learning how to coordinate the breath, tongue, and lips to purposefully produce those phonemes we talked about earlier.
And their comprehension's moving much faster than their production, right? By 6 months, they're usually recognizing their own name, isolating it from the stream of speech.
Yeah.
And then by 10 to 12 months, the first single words appear. But how do they know which words to pay attention to? I mean, if I'm speaking in a rapid, continuous flow, how does a baby know where one word ends and another begins?
They rely heavily on contextual acoustic cues provided by the parents. And this brings us to another landmark study by Worker, Pegg, and McLeod in 1994, focusing on what is formally called infant-directed speech.
Oh, infant-directed speech. You mean baby talk.
Yes, baby talk.
The high-pitched, exaggerated sing-song voice we all instinctively use when we're looking at a newborn.
Exactly. But from a cognitive perspective, it is a highly sophisticated pedagogical tool. The researchers wanted to know if babies actually preferred this.
Did they?
They did. They measured infant attention and found that babies listened significantly longer and more intently to infant-directed speech than to normal, flat, adult-directed speech.
Why does the pitch and the rhythm matter so much to them?
Because it basically acts as acoustic highlighting. By exaggerating the vowels and placing heavy pauses between phrases, parents are artificially breaking the chaotic stream of language into digestible syntactic chunks. It helps the baby's brain map the boundaries of words.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It's like putting spaces between the words for them. Now, as they start mapping these words, around 1 or 2 years old, you see a phenomenon the chapter calls overextension.
Ah, yes. Overextension.
I want to highlight this because it's a beautiful look into how a child's logic actually works. Overextension is when a child uses a word in a broader context than is actually appropriate.
Can you give the listeners an example of how a student might see this in real life?
Yeah, my nephew actually did this. He learned the word doggy for the family's golden retriever.
Okay.
A week later, he saw a horse on television, and he pointed at it and yelled, "Doggy!" Later, he saw Flucky Cat Doggy.
That's perfect.
He had grasped a core semantic feature, 4 legs, furry, animal, but he'd overextended the boundaries of the category.
And while parents often correct this as a mistake, cognitive psychologists view it as a massive triumph.
Really? A triumph.
Yes, the child is actively forming hypotheses about semantic categories and testing them against the world. They are building a mental model.
Okay, so the child building models, practicing phonemes, absorbing baby talk. This is the timeline. But it still doesn't answer the mechanism of how the actual rules of syntax get inside their head.
No, it doesn't.
And this is where the academic bloodbath begins, nature versus nurture.
Oh, it is the defining debate of 20th century linguistics. In one corner, representing nurture, you have the towering figure of B.F. Skinner and the behaviorist movement.
Okay, let's give Skinner a fair shake here. The behaviorist argument is incredibly logical on its surface.
It is.
Skinner argued that language is not special. It is just a behavior, no different from a rat learning to press a lever for a food pellet. We learn language entirely through association, imitation, and reinforcement.
According to Skinner, a baby randomly babbles the sound, ah. The mother's face lights up. She smiles. She showers the baby with affection.
Positive reinforcement.
Exactly. That positive reinforcement conditions the baby to associate the sound with a reward. As the child grows, they simply imitate the sentences they hear adults say. They get rewarded when they are understood, and through thousands of these micro-interactions, language is shaped.
It sounds totally plausible. It makes sense until you look closely at what children actually say. And the textbook destroys Skinner's argument with one specific concept, generativity.
Generativity is the fatal flaw in the behaviorist theory of language. Let's look at the actual mechanism of it. If Skinner is right, children only say what they have heard and imitated.
Right.
But children constantly say things they have never, ever heard an adult say.
But the classic example is a child saying, "I swam in the pool," or "I holded the rabbit."
Yes.
No adult native speaker says swimmed. The child did not imitate that. So where did the word come from?
It came from the child's internal deduction of a rule. The child unconsciously realized, to talk about the past in English, I add the ed sound.
Right.
They extracted the abstract rule of syntax, and then they generated a completely novel word by applying the rule to an irregular verb. They are not biological tape recorders playing back what they heard. They are rule-making engines.
And the man who drove this stake through the heart of behaviorism was the linguist Noam Chomsky. Chomsky argued for the nature side of the debate, the nativist theory.
Right. Chomsky looked at generativity. He looked at how quickly infants learn grammar, despite incomplete and messy input from adults. And he concluded that the rules of language cannot merely be learned from the environment.
They must be innate.
Yes, they must be biologically pre-installed. He proposed that human beings are born with a neurological module called the Language Acquisition Device, or LAD.
The LAD. So Chomsky's basically saying we come with the operating system preloaded on our hard drives.
Yes. Specifically, he argued that the LAD contains a universal grammar. Now, he isn't saying you are born secretly knowing English or Japanese.
That would be weird.
Right. He is saying that beneath the staggering diversity of all 6,000 human languages, there is a fundamental shared mathematical architecture, a set of parameters for how language must work. We are born knowing the parameters. We just use the environment to flip the specific switches for our local language.
To explain how this works, Chomsky introduced a distinction between deep structure and surface structure. I want to really dig into this because it's a brilliant way to understand how we extract meaning.
Let's do it. Deep structure is the abstract, fundamental idea of the thought. It is the raw semantic intention in your brain.
Okay.
Surface structure is the actual string of physical words and sounds you use to express it in a specific language.
So if my deep structure thought is about a canine attacking a male human, I can create multiple surface structures. I can say the dog bit the man, or I can say the man was bitten by the dog. Completely different syntax, different order, but the exact same deep structure meaning.
And Chomsky argued that our innate universal grammar is what allows us to instantly map the surface structures we hear onto the deep structures we intuitively understand. We strip away the surface grammar to get to the core meaning.
I always relate this to taking a college lecture course.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
If you are sitting in a lecture hall, the professor is throwing thousands of surface structures at you. If you try to memorize the exact verbatim sentences, the surface structure, you will fail the exam. Our brains just aren't built for that.
No, they're not.
But if you listen to the sentences, strip away the words, and store the core concept, the deep structure, you will ace the test. We remember the gist, not the transcript.
That is the perfect functional analogy for Chomsky's theory. We are absolutely designed to seek the depth structure. But, if you are a skeptic, you might be thinking, okay, universal grammar is a neat theory, but where's the physical proof that it exists independent of adult teaching?
And the textbook answers that skepticism with arguably the most astonishing, chillingly beautiful story in all of modern cognitive science, the birth of Nicaraguan Sign Language.
It is a profound piece of evidence. To understand its impact, you really have to understand the historical setup.
Set the stage for us.
Until the late 1970s, there was no formal school for the deaf in Nicaragua. Deaf children were largely isolated in their homes, scattered across the country.
Right.
They communicated with their families using rudimentary, idiosyncratic home signs, basic mimes, like pointing to the mouth for food. But they had no shared language and no syntax.
Then the government opens this massive school for the deaf in Managua, bringing hundreds of these isolated kids together for the very first time. The teachers are mostly trying to teach them lip reading and spoken Spanish, which is, well, largely a failure. The classroom instruction just isn't working.
But then the researchers start observing what is happening out on the playground, on the school buses, away from the teacher.
The kids are enacting.
Yes. These children, desperate to communicate, begin pooling their home signs together. But what happened next is what stunned the linguistics world, documented extensively by researchers like Judy Senghas.
As new, younger children entered the school. They didn't just learn this crude, mimed vocabulary from the older kids. They fundamentally transformed it.
They did.
The younger kids took the fluid mimes of the older kids and shattered them into discrete grammatical units.
Let's explain the mechanism of how they did that, because it's incredible. If an older child wanted to describe a bowling ball rolling down a hill, they would use one continuous sweeping hand motion of a ball rolling downward. It was a mime, a single holistic gesture.
But the younger kids looked at that mime and their brains implicitly rejected it. Their brains basically said, this isn't syntax.
Right.
So the younger kids split the motion. They created one distinct sign to the object, the ball, another distinct sign for the action rolling, and a third distinct sign for the direction down. They literally invented syntactic rules for how those separate signs must be ordered.
Completely unsupervised by adults, without any exposure to spoken or sign grammar, the children spontaneously invented Nicaraguan Sign Language. They invented a fully functional, complex grammatical system out of thin air.
It gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. It is the ultimate vindication of Chomsky.
It really is.
The children weren't imitating adults because the adults didn't know sign language. They weren't being reinforced by Skinnerian rewards. Their innate language acquisition device took the raw, unstructured clay of human desire to communicate and forced it into a mathematically precise grammatical structure. The drive for syntax is just a biological imperative.
It proves the system is hardwired. But, as we saw earlier with the tragic case of Jeannie, that hardwiring has an expiration date. Which brings us to Section 4 of our deep dive, the biological window of opportunity and the research surrounding the critical period.
We know from Jeannie that if you miss early exposure, the hardware atrophies. But cognitive psychologists want to know the exact parameters of this window. Is there a hard biological deadline for learning language?
Right.
To answer this, we need to look closely at the methodology of a landmark 1989 study by Johnson and Newport. And I want to emphasize this for you listening. Understanding how this study was conducted is just as important as knowing the results, because it shows you how psychologists isolate variables.
That's a great point. Johnson and Newport wanted to test the critical period theory, but they needed the right subjects. They couldn't use children raised in isolation, so they recruited adult participants who were native speakers of Chinese and Korean, but who had immigrated to the United States at various ages.
And the choice of Chinese and Korean is a massive, deliberate, variable control. Why those specific languages?
Because the syntactical structure of Chinese and Korean is fundamentally radically different from English grammar.
Ah, okay.
If the researchers had used immigrants from Germany or the Netherlands, the similarity of those Germanic languages to English might have given the participants an unfair advantage in learning English syntax. By using Chinese and Korean speakers, they ensured the participants had to acquire an entirely alien set of grammatical rules.
Okay, so you have this really diverse group of immigrants. Some arrived in the U.S. when they were 3 years old, some when they were 15, some when they were 39. They've all been living in the U.S. for years now. How do you actually measure their mastery of the rules of language? I mean, you can't just ask them if they speak well.
No, self-reporting wouldn't work. You give them a grammatical judgment task.
Okay.
The researchers placed the participants in a room and played audio recordings of English sentences. Some of the sentences were perfectly grammatical. Others contained subtle, highly specific syntactic errors. For example, a sentence might be, "The little boy is speak to a policeman," instead of speaking. The task was simply to indicate whether the sentence was grammatically correct or incorrect.
And the data they got back completely reshaped how we view neuroplasticity. They found that for the immigrants who arrived in the U.S. before the age of 7, their performance on the grammar test was virtually indistinguishable from native-born American English speakers.
Exactly the same.
It did not matter if they had lived in the U.S. for 5 years or 20 years, arriving before age 7 basically guaranteed native-level fluency in the deep rules of syntax.
But the real revelation was what happened to the participants who arrived after age 7. The classic critical period theory assumed there would be a cliff. It assumed that at puberty, a switch would flip in the brain, the window would slam shut, and learning syntax would become biologically impossible.
But the data didn't show a cliff.
No, it showed a slope. For those arriving between age 8 and age 39, there was a gradual, steady, downward decline in grammatical proficiency based on their age of arrival. The older you were when you arrived, the lower your average score.
And what I found so interesting was the variance in the data. For the kids who arrived at age 4, everyone scored perfectly. But for the adults who arrived at age 25, the scores were just all over the map.
They were.
Some struggled immensely, barely identifying the errors, but a few of them actually scored incredibly well.
And that variance is the key. If the biological window had truly slammed shut, no adult would have scored well. Because some adults could still master the syntax, cognitive psychologists had to revise the theory.
Okay.
We no longer strictly call it a critical period, which implies an absolute cutoff. We now call it a sensitive period. The brain's neuroplasticity for language gradually stiffens, making it much harder and requiring much more conscious effort. But it's not biologically impossible.
It's a sensitive period. And speaking of neuroplasticity and the physical structure of the brain, we have to talk about the bilingual brain. This is a topic where the textbook aggressively attacks an old societal misconception.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, there was a deeply entrenched myth in education that teaching a child 2 languages simultaneously was actually dangerous.
Dangerous.
Yeah. The assumption was that the brain had limited heart drive space and that juggling 2 vocabularies would confuse the child, slow down their cognitive development, or cause linguistic delays.
It's the idea that if you pour 2 different liquids into a cup, it's just going to overflow and make a mess. But modern cognitive psychology, backed by fMRI brain imaging, has violently debunked this.
Completely. In fact, bilingualism might be one of the most powerful cognitive enhancements a human being can undergo.
Wow.
Because a bilingual brain is constantly suppressing one set of syntactical rules and vocabulary to use the other, it is essentially doing heavy resistance training for its executive functioning.
Executive functioning, like the cognitive control center.
Right. Research demonstrates that bilingual individuals show superior cognitive flexibility, better problem-solving skills, and a significantly enhanced ability to filter out distracting, irrelevant information. Their brains are highly trained at focusing on the target while ignoring the noise.
But it's not just a software upgrade, right? It's a hardware upgrade.
It is.
The textbook points out that highly proficient bilinguals, especially those who learn their second language early, have physically different brains. Scans show they have a significantly denser, thicker left hemisphere, which is where the primary language centers, like Broca's and Wernicke's areas, reside.
Yes.
The brain literally builds more gray matter, more neuronal density, to handle the structural complexity of managing 2 universal grammars.
So we've established that the human brain is an exquisite, structurally adapted, developmentally primed machine for language. It reshapes itself based on input, it creates dense neural networks to manage multiple codes, and it possesses an innate drive to generate syntax.
Which brings us to the final looming question of the chapter. We spent all this time talking about how unique and specialized human biology is for this task. But are we entirely alone? Does the animal kingdom have access to this, or are we the sole possessors of the crown jewel?
This is where we cross from strict linguistics into evolutionary psychology, and we really have to set the ground rules first. No cognitive psychologist denies that animals communicate.
Right, communication is everywhere. A dog baring its teeth is communicating aggression. A bee performing a figure-8 waggle dance is communicating the precise vector and distance to a pollen source. Vervet monkeys have distinct alarm calls for eagle versus leopard.
But is that language? Remember our parameters. Language, as defined by Chomsky and the evidence of Nicaraguan Sign Language, requires generativity. It requires syntax.
Right.
It requires the ability to combine arbitrary symbols into an infinite number of novel, meaningful sequences. An animal alarm call is a fixed biological reflex. It is one stimulus, one response. Can any animal break out of the reflex and generate syntax?
To explore this boundary, we have to look at the primate research, specifically the groundbreaking work with a bonobo named Kanzi, conducted by Savage Rumbaugh and Lewin in the 1990s.
Now, researchers learned from early failed experiments in the 1960s that you cannot teach an ape spoken language. They simply do not have the anatomical vocal tract required to produce phones.
They just physically can't do it.
Exactly. So for Kanzi, they used a large computerized keyboard covered in lexicograms.
Lexicograms being abstract, geometric symbols that represent specific words. They don't look like the objects they represent, so the ape has to understand the abstract symbolic relationship.
Exactly. But what makes Kanzi's story so pivotal is how he learned these symbols. In previous ape studies, like the famous Nim-Chimpsky project, researchers used intense Skinner-style operant conditioning. They aggressively rewarded the apes with food for pressing the right buttons. It was rote training.
But Kanzi wasn't actually the subject of the experiment, right? The researchers were trying to train Kanzi's adoptive mother, Matata.
Yes.
Kanzi was just an infant clinging to his mother, hanging out in the lab, while the humans desperately tried to get Matata to understand the keyboard. And Matata largely failed. She never really grasped the system.
But Kanzi was passively observing. Without being directly trained, without being explicitly rewarded with food for correct answers, Kanzi was absorbing the lexicograms. He was in his own biological sensitive period, just like a human infant.
Right.
And one day, when Matata was away, Kanzi spontaneously walked up to the keyboard and began pressing the lexicograms to accurately communicate his desires.
He learned it purely through social observation. But, the real test isn't just vocabulary. Did he show syntax? Did he show generativity?
This is where Kanzi really blurs the line between human and animal cognition. Kanzi didn't just use the keyboard to say, "give banana." He used the symbols to comment on social events happening around him. He expressed intentions for the future. He showed a rudimentary understanding of word order, distinguishing between Kanzi chase dog and dog chase Kanzi.
And his comprehension of spoken English was even more staggering. The researchers would wear welding masks so Kanzi couldn't read their facial expressions, and they would give him completely novel, bizarre commands he had never heard before.
Yes, to test his understanding.
Things like, put the pine needles in the refrigerator, or can you make the dog bite the snake?
And Kanzi would correctly execute the physical actions, proving he understood the syntactic relationship between the subject, verb, and object in a completely novel context. He showed generativity in his comprehension.
That's amazing.
Add to this the fact that he learned to manufacture basic stone tools and could understand the rules of the video game Pac-Man well enough to actually play it, and you have an animal that possesses a frighteningly high level of cognitive representation.
Pause for a second and think about this. I have to ask you, looking at Kanzi, where do we draw the line? If a bonobo can use abstract symbols to comment on a social interaction, if he can understand a novel sentence like, put the pine needles in the fridge, does that shatter Chomsky's claim that the language acquisition device is exclusively human?
It's the debate that keeps linguists up at night. The strict Chomskyians argue that while Kanzi is incredibly intelligent, his syntax never progressed beyond the level of a 2.5-year-old human. He never generated the complex, recursive, nested sentences that humans naturally develop.
Okay.
So he showed the foundations of language, but not the infinite architecture.
So it's a matter of degree rather than a hard biological wall. Kanzi proves the cognitive hardware for symbolic representation exists in our primate cousins, but perhaps humans just possess a massively supercharged version of the syntax engine.
Exactly. It shows that language didn't just magically appear out of nowhere in humans. It evolved from cognitive foundations that are shared, to some extent, across the primate lineage.
This has been an absolutely massive journey into the architecture of the mind. Let's pull the scaffolding back together and look at the structure we've built today.
We started at the absolute microscopic level of human perception. We saw how infants begin as universal listeners, capable of hearing every phone, but rapidly prune those neural pathways by 10 months for metabolic efficiency, locking themselves into the soundscape of their native language.
We looked at the executable code morphemes and how they snap together. Then we dove into the cognitive math of parsing. We explored how the garden path model proves our brains prioritize speed over semantics, using lazy rules like minimal attachment to build syntactic trees, which occasionally leads us into hilarious dead ends with ambiguous newspaper headlines.
We tracked the developmental timeline from babbling to overextension, realizing that children are constantly building and testing hypotheses about meaning. And we tackled the great 20th century debate, Skinner's theory of imitation and reward against Chomsky's nativist theory.
And Chomsky won that round with the concept of generativity, the fact that children create novel rules like saying swimmed. We saw the ultimate proof of this innate drive in the deaf children, who spontaneously invented the complex syntax of Nicaraguan Sign Language on a playground.
We went into the lab with Johnson and Newport, discovering that the critical period for acquiring the syntax is really a gradual, sensitive slope of declining neuroplasticity rather than a sudden cliff at puberty. We debunked the myth of the full hard drive, seeing how bilingualism physically densifies the brain's executive control centers.
And finally, we looked at Kanzi the bonobo, challenging our anthropocentric arrogance and asking whether the spark of syntax might glow, however faintly, in other branches of the evolutionary tree.
It is a profound chapter, and before we close, I want to leave you with one final, deeply unsettling question to mull over before your next lecture. We established at the very beginning that language is the operating system for thought. It dictates how we categorize the world. So, consider this. If your native language has strict syntactic rules that force you to constantly specify the gender of objects, or the precise direction of an action, or the social hierarchy of the person you're speaking to, Does speaking that language physically alter what your brain pays attention to in the real world? If the rules of your language change, does the very reality you perceive change with it?
Wow, that is the ultimate cognitive rabbit hole. Does the code dictate the reality? It's a brilliant question to take into your class discussions. And as a final reminder to you listening, while we hope we've illuminated the dark corners of these theories, this audio deep dive is a study companion, not a magic pill.
Exactly.
It does not replace the hard work of reading Chapter 8, grappling with the source material, and engaging with your course activities. We're just here to help you see the blueprint. Keep asking questions, keep pushing back on the theories, and good luck in your cognitive psychology class.
When you